It was a gray winter afternoon, the kind of day when the clouds hung low and the hallways of the high school seemed dim, even with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Students were sitting through their last class of the day, restless and half asleep, when the intercom suddenly screeched to life with an announcement that made everyone's blood run cold. "Attention! This is a lockdown. Repeat, this is a lockdown. Teachers, secure your rooms immediately." At first, some thought it was just another drill. Lockdowns had become routine enough that most students welcomed them. 15 minutes of sitting quietly, scrolling through their phones, anything to escape classwork. But there was something about the voice on the intercom that day. It wasn't calm and practiced like usual. It was sharp, rushed, and frightened. Their teacher moved instantly, snapping off the lights and rushing to the door. She twisted the lock, tugged the handle twice to make sure it was secure, then pulled down the blinds with shaking hands. Her urgency made it clear this wasn't a drill. The students exchanged uneasy glances. They slid off their chairs and crouched on the floor against the wall, pressed into the shadows farthest from the door. Phones lit up like tiny flashlights as trembling fingers texted friends in other classrooms. The whispers began almost immediately. "What's going on? Do you think someone's inside? This better be fake." But no one had answers. The silence outside the room was heavy and strange. Usually in drills there were faint sounds of shuffling, giggles, or teachers giving hushed instructions. This time, it felt like the whole school was holding its breath. Then came the first sound that made everyone's stomachs drop, the slow rattle of the doorknob. Every head turned toward the door. The handle twisted once, twice, as if someone was testing it. The teacher froze where she stood, her back pressed against the wall, one hand raised to her lips to signal silence. The students went rigid, their breathing shallow and quick. A girl pressed her palms over her mouth to stop herself from gasping. The rattling stopped, but not because of safety. It stopped the way a predator pauses when it knows its prey has heard it. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Then, slow, deliberate footsteps began to echo down the hallway. Whoever it was wasn't running. They were walking calmly, as though they had all the time in the world. A shadow passed over the small rectangular window in the door. The shape lingered, unmoving. The students could see the outline of a head tilting, as if the person was peering in. Nobody dared to breathe. One wrong sound could give them away. The shadow eventually slid away, but the footsteps didn't fade completely. They lingered, circling back, retreating, then returning. It was as though the intruder was pacing, waiting for someone to make a mistake. A boy's phone buzzed loudly, making everyone flinch. He fumbled to silence it, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. The message had come from his sister in another classroom. "Someone tried our door too. Stay quiet, it's not safe." He showed it to the others, and panic rippled silently through the group. Minutes dragged on. Some students silently cried. Others gripped each other's hands so tightly their fingers turned white. The teacher crouched near the group, whispering, "Stay down. Don't move. Don't make a sound." Her voice cracked as she said it, betraying her own terror. Finally, after what felt like forever, the intercom crackled again. "The lockdown is over. Teachers, remain in your rooms until further instructions." No one moved. No one trusted it. The teacher shook her head, signaling them to stay put. They waited another long, painful 20 minutes before police officers appeared at the door and led them out. The hallways looked ordinary, lockers lined up neatly, posters fluttering slightly in the draft. But the truth was anything but normal. Later, they learned a man had slipped inside through a side entrance that hadn't latched properly. He hadn't been carrying a visible weapon, but he had been roaming the halls, pulling at doors, watching through windows. The police never figured out what he wanted. For the students in that classroom, the unanswered question was the most haunting part. They could still hear the sound of the handle rattling, still see the shadow through the glass. The thought that a thin piece of metal had been the only thing between them, and the stranger was enough to keep them awake at night for weeks. Some said they never looked at their school doors the same way again. Even years later, when someone absent-mindedly jiggles a doorknob in a quiet hallway, those who lived through that day feel their stomachs drop. Because once you've hidden in the dark, while danger stands just inches away, the sound of a rattling handle is something you never forget. The second story comes from a suburban middle school, where a lockdown turned an ordinary afternoon into one of the most terrifying experiences of the students' lives. It was just after lunch when the announcement came over the loudspeaker. Attention. We are in lockdown. This is not a drill. At first, some students laughed nervously. They had just been joking around in the cafeteria, and now teachers were barking orders, rushing them into the gymnasium. The heavy metal doors were pulled shut and locked. Teachers quickly guided dozens of kids to sit on the polished wooden floor. Phones flickered like fireflies as students texted their parents and friends. Some messages got replies right away. What's happening? Are you okay? Others went unanswered, adding to the unease. The gym felt massive and exposed. The overhead lights had been cut, leaving only the faint red glow of emergency bulbs along the walls. The shadows stretched long and menacing across the floor, turning the space into something unfamiliar and frightening. For the first few minutes, the only sounds were whispers and the squeak of sneakers against wood as students tried to shift into more comfortable positions. But then, a loud bang echoed from somewhere outside the gym. It sounded like a door slamming, or something much worse. The gym fell silent. A teacher hissed, "Phones off." Quiet. And the glow of screens disappeared one by one. Dozens of children sat in complete stillness, straining their ears. Another noise followed, slow, heavy footsteps in the hallway just outside. Whoever it was moved with purpose, not like a teacher or staff member, but with a dragging, uneven gait that made the hair on the back of every neck stand up. The steps stopped right outside the gym. Everyone froze. Students clutched each other's arms, their nails digging into skin. Teachers stood stiff, exchanging silent, panicked looks. The thick gym doors suddenly seemed too thin, too fragile. A shadow appeared beneath the crack at the bottom of the door. Whoever it was had stopped directly outside, unmoving, like they were listening. Minutes crawled by. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the occasional nervous breath or stifled sob. Then came the sound that made everyone's blood run cold. The metallic clink of the gym door handle being tested. The handle jiggled once, twice. The intruder pulled at it hard enough that the door rattled in its frame. Some of the younger students started crying quietly. A teacher pressed a finger to her lips, eyes wide, mouthing "please, please," as if begging them not to make a sound. Finally, the rattling stopped. The footsteps moved away, fading down the hall. But the relief didn't last long. A loud metallic crash rang out somewhere else in the building, followed by the shrill screech of lockers being kicked or slammed. The sound echoed like thunder through the school. In the gym, everyone sat paralyzed. The teachers whispered among themselves, debating if they should move the students into the locker rooms for extra safety. But moving meant noise, and noise could mean being found. They decided to stay put. Time dragged on. Minutes felt like hours. The red glow of the emergency lights made faces look pale and ghostly. At some point, the faint sound of crying became constant, muffled sobs that no one dared to shush anymore. Then, as suddenly as it began, the intercom crackled. "Lockdown is lifted. Police are securing the building. Remain in place until officers arrive." The words didn't bring comfort. If anything, they deepened the fear. The teachers didn't move until uniformed officers finally opened the doors and guided them out in groups. What the police revealed later left everyone shaken. A man had been spotted near the campus carrying a large duffel bag. When officers entered the building, they found several doors marked with scratches near the handles, as if someone had been trying to force them open. The man was never caught. The bag, if there was one, was never recovered. For the students in that gym, the image of a shadow beneath the door and the sound of the rattling handle would never fade. Some admitted later that they couldn't sleep for weeks without the lights on. Others flinched at the sound of footsteps in a quiet hallway. And even years later, when they passed by the gym where it happened, they felt the memory tighten around their chest, reminding them how fragile safety could be. The third story took place at a high school on the outskirts of town, surrounded by fields and woods that always seemed to whisper with the wind. Students had often joked that if anything ever happened, they were too far from help for police to arrive in time. One spring afternoon, that thought stopped being a joke. It was during 7th period when the intercom buzzed. "Lockdown. Teachers, lock your doors immediately. This is not a drill." The words cut through the air like ice. The teacher, a usually calm man, went pale as he rushed to the door and turned the lock. He shut off the lights and told everyone to move to the far corner of the classroom. No one dared ask questions. Something in his voice told them it was serious. The students huddled in silence. The classroom blinds were pulled tight, but a faint glow from the setting sun still seeped through the edges, casting long shadows across the floor. Some students clutched their phones, trying to text parents or friends, but cell service was suddenly unreliable. A few messages went through, most didn't. That only deepened the unease. Then came the first sound. A faint thud echoed from down the hallway, like a locker being slammed shut. Moments later, another noise. A dragging sound, heavy and slow, as if something or someone was scraping along the floor. The students pressed closer together, their eyes darting toward the door. Suddenly, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps that echoed louder and louder as they drew near. The teacher crouched low, putting a finger to his lips. The students barely breathed. The footsteps stopped right outside their door. The classroom went dead silent. All anyone could hear was the pounding of their own hearts. Then, the doorknob turned. Once, twice, slowly, almost experimentally. A metallic click echoed through the room as the lock held firm. One girl clamped her hands over her mouth, fighting the urge to scream. Another student silently cried, tears running down his face. The teacher stayed frozen, his body tensed like a spring, ready for whatever came next. But the intruder didn't leave. Instead, they stood outside the door for what felt like forever. A faint shadow shifted across the narrow glass pane in the door. Whoever it was leaned close, pressing against the window. Students swore later that they saw an eye staring back at them through the glass, unblinking, watching. And then came the voice. A low, muffled whisper seeped through the door. No one could make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, taunting, coaxing, like someone daring them to open the door. Some students buried their faces in their arms, too terrified to look. The whispering stopped. Then the footsteps returned, this time moving slowly down the hall. But just when relief began to settle, a loud bang echoed, as though something heavy had been slammed against a locker. Then another. The sound carried through the entire building, followed by the screech of metal scraping on tile. The students stayed huddled in the corner, every sound amplified in the suffocating silence. A few thought they could hear faint laughter in the distance, though no one was sure if it was real or just their imagination playing cruel tricks. Time dragged on. 5 minutes felt like 50. Finally, the intercom crackled. Lockdown has ended. Remain in your classrooms until law enforcement arrives. The teacher didn't budge. He kept everyone in place until officers personally came to the door and escorted them out. Later, the truth surfaced. Security cameras had captured a man wandering the halls. He wasn't armed, but he carried something large and heavy in a bag. At one point, he stood outside several classrooms, pulling at their doors. When police searched the building, he was gone. No trace of him was ever found. For the students in that classroom, the experience left scars. Some swore they could still hear the faint whisper at the door in their dreams. Others avoided walking down that hallway altogether, claiming it always felt colder, quieter, as if the walls themselves remembered. The worst part was never knowing who he was or what he wanted. The mystery made it even more haunting, a story that spread from student to student until it became legend. But for the ones who lived it, it wasn't just a story. It was the memory of pressing into a dark corner, holding their breath, while something, or someone, stood just inches away on the other side of the door.